Hello again, everybody. This is me again with some more doping-related research. This time I'm going to talk about a relatively recent paper named the Multiplayer Performance Enhancing Drug Game. The title should indicate that this is an extension of a previous paper of mine named the Performance Enhancing Drug Game, and that's correct. The paper is published in PLoS ONE, one of the really big new open access journals, and if you haven't considered that one as a publishing channel, I suppose you should. Maybe you should. Again, this is co-authored work together with Andrea Petroxi of London, UK, as well as Tamas Nepos from Budapest. It was Lorand University at the time of writing. This work has been a fairly long process. I think we started it back in 2009. It was actually published in 2013, so it has been kind of a long process. The paper is maybe on the more technical side, but I will try to avoid most of the real technical difficulties related to the project. So let's hope you like it, and have a nice view. Okay, as always, we start by finding the presentation. You should know the drill by now, so we just search for academia.edu and my name and enter the top link here, and after not too much time we enter this site, and as always it's located here under conference presentation. This time it's on the top here. The name is the Multiplayer Performance Enhancing Drug Game, and we just open the presentation and download it to get it easier on the full screen. Okay, the title should indicate that this is on doping again, and it is. As stated previously, it's co-worked together with Tamas Nepos and Andrea Petroxi, and the title should kind of give you all answers on what this is about. So what we do here basically is to extend the two-player game version back from 2004 in Journal of Sports Economics into a multiplayer version. So we kind of take the step of looking on the effects of having more than two players in doping games. Okay, a short outline. The first thing, of course, which we have to do here is to kind of transform the original two-player model into a multiplayer model, and that is discussed under point 1 here, referred to as modeling. Then at point 2 we kind of do something which is fairly unusual when we present research, to kind of look into the history of the paper. As I mentioned in the introduction, this was kind of a long process, so it has been back and forth from different journals, and various non-published results may be interesting to look at. This is point 2. Then point 3 we kind of briefly discussed the main output in the paper, and as it kind of manifested itself in the end, it kind of turned out to be two proofs, or actually two theorems with corresponding proofs. Point 5, we will have a brief talk on some relevant conclusions. We start by looking at remodeling the performance enhancing drug game. Okay, so we have some points here. There are basically 4 main changes in the original assumptions of the previous model. Perhaps the most important is the introduction of a so-called price function. Now, to be more formal, at point 1 we kind of change this assumption of 2 players into n players or an n-player game. As a consequence, the parameters R and C, which corresponds to the probability of being exposed in performance-enhancing drug use, as well as the cost involved in that exposure, we now, of course, look at a situation where we have several players. And it could be that we at some point would like to model different exposure probabilities as well as different cost consequences. It could be certain areas of the world which look at doping at one way, while it may be other areas in the world that look at doping in different ways. It could be better anti-doping policy programs, let's say in the West, compared to perhaps the East, and of course that should indicate different exposure probabilities. So we can open up this opportunity of looking at diversified R's and C's. Of course that's straightforward mathematically by just introducing a subscript here. So Ri would be the exposure probability for player I, while Ci is the consequential cost for player I of being exposed as a PED abuser. At point 3, we now have to kind of do the same in a way on these A's of the original model. The A was of course the payoff or the utility received by the winning agent, and in this case, of course, when there are more than 2 players, there is not only a first and last position, there is the first and second and third and so on, so we have to open up for varying utilities among varying ranked players. So AI here is the payoff received by the player achieving rank I in the contest. And of course, we assume here, which seems reasonable, that the best athlete gets the highest prize, A1, which is then assumed larger than A2, and so on. And we also make an assumption that the lowest prize is not negative, even though there is a lot of competitions which may have that structure. You know, these big races, for instance, where you have to pay a fairly high entrance fee, and if you and fairly below the mid of the ranking list, you typically don't get a prize. So there is actually a lot of competitions which allow for negative A's. I don't think we really make that this assumption would lead to any loss of generality. We refer to this set of A's as the price function. Mark here that in this situation we can open up for different shapes of such price functions. We can give a lot to number 1 and a lot to number 2 and very little to the rest, for instance, or we can change all these kind of combinations. So there is suddenly a whole infinity of different price functions to kind of analyze in relation to the, should we say, the game theoretic behavior, and this will turn out to be important. Finally, at point 4, we introduce a parameter which we refer to as D, and we assume that this D is between 0 and n, where n is the number of players, and as it's defined here is the number of players taking drugs. Obviously, if there is a total of n players in the game, then n minus D would be the athletes which do not take drugs. And the reason for this introduction is, of course, that this D has a kind of meaning. It's often referred to in doping literature as the so-called doping prevalence, and it tells us, in a sense, the share of drug users in some kind of population of athletes. Okay, now given the original inherited assumptions, which, if you may remember, include that we kind of assume cloned athletes here, as well as an effective drug, then what will happen here, when all these n athletes are equally good, is that if we partition it into two groups, the so-called script D group, which are the dopers, and the script ND group, which are the non-dopers, then of course, given that the drug is effective, that it really works, the first D athletes on the ranking list would be dopers. Okay? Because the drug is effective, and then one of these group will win the competition. The non-dopers, which have no positive effect of the drug and are of course initially equal with the other guys, will then populate the lower half, or the part from d+1 up to n of the ranking list. And given that still that we have cloned athletes, and there's a single effective drug, of course, the probability that n in the drug group would win, as opposed to any other, is the same. It must be 1 divided by d, as is given in equation 1 here. The same, of course, holds for these non-doping guys, but they will have to then compute their probabilities for a certain ranking position below d as 1 over n minus d, which is referred to in equation 2. This should be straightforward. Okay, let's have a look at the payoffs here. Now, given the previous probabilities, we can then straightforwardly compute expected payoffs for each player in each of the two groups, which we have defined. The script D group as well as the script ND group. Of course, the script D group, they will get ranking payoffs from A1 up to AD. And each of these dopers face the risk of being exposed. So there is a certain expected cost here, which then will be Ri times Ci. And of course, the probability of any ranking here is the same, 1 over d. So we get the expression 3 here. That should be, that should be straightforward to realize. Similarly, for the non-dopers, they have a probability of 1 over n minus d for populating positions d+1, d+2, and so on up to n. And again, based on inherited assumptions, there is no exposure risks for non-dopers. We assume a perfect doping test, so to speak here. So they will just divide the remaining prices among them. So that gives us these two expressions for the expected payoff for the D group as well as the expected payoff for the ND group. Again, relatively straightforward. Okay, that kind of sets the setting. We have kind of tuned our model into an n-player setting. We had to introduce this price function structure, and we also introduced some player-dependent costs as well as probabilities, but apart from that, it's really not a big deal. Now, let's look at something which was not published in the paper. We start with a continuous non-published approximation. Okay. Now, if we introduce mixed strategy probabilities, named PI here, of course, then we can compute a combined expected payoff for any player I by just weighing equation 3 with PI and equation 4 with 1 minus PI, which will produce equation 5 here. This is straightforward. We just multiply the previous expressions with PI here and 1 minus PI there. Okay, and add together. The problem with this expression is that it's discrete. Okay, so there are discrete sums here, and one of the variables that's interesting for us is, of course, this doping prevalence. We are interested in kind of seeing how these D may develop. For instance, as a function of the number of players or whatever, or what kind of price functions we put on it. Could we kind of affect the doping prevalence positively or negatively by choosing different price functions, for instance? That could be an interesting question to answer. So in order to avoid this kind of difficulty, what we did then initially, which again I should mention was not published in the paper, was to introduce a continuous approximation to this discrete part of 5. So you see here that we introduce something we refer to as CA as a function of D, which then is in fact equal, or meant as an approximation to the sum from I equals 1 to D of AI. So we can substitute this AI part and of course AJ part here by logically correct versions including this CA. Given that, then we get this expression 6. It's straightforward to see that this last sum here turns out to be this A, capital A minus CIID, if that anyone wonders on that. Okay, now why did we not continue this line on. Of course, one reason was that there were a certain amount of referees who didn't like it. In the end, perhaps we didn't like it ourselves either. So let's start here. Given 6, it's or the previous equation is straightforward to calculate and in principle solve the resulting equational system for the fixed points or the Nash equilibria for all these I in 1 up to n. So of course then we can compute the partial derivatives of this now continuous pi I function with respect to each of the p's, p1 up to pn. That produces a equational system which is kind of given in this equational 7 here. As it turns out, this system of equations is, at least in general, unfortunately quintic, meaning that you kind of have an order 5 here. And for those of you acquainted with old-fashioned mathematics, they should know that back in many years ago, an Italian named Ruffini and finally Niels-Henrik Abel in 1823 kind of proved that you cannot guarantee any analytic solution to a polynomial of the degree 5. So, as a consequence, we thought, now, instead of approximating the original formulation and then again having to do some kind of numerical approximations based founded on this approximation 7, we might as well look at a direct numerical approach. It might as well be just as sufficient to just look at using some software perhaps to look at the Nash equilibria instead of doing this. Perhaps what we could have done was to look at an even more approximative approximation, trying to get real analytic solutions. Of course, again, approximative, but that could lead into some interesting intuition. We did not continue that line of arguments. Okay. As it says here, we did some numerical, again, non-published experiments with a software package called Gambit. Gambit is an open source software. It's available from this link here, so if you want to look at it, you can have a look. It's a nice program system to look at numerical solutions to game theory problems. Now, these, again, non-published experiments indicates a little bit about what kind of results we will end up with here. You see here a figure, or actually two figures, which shows some numerical results by looking at this model in Gambit. You see here that there is a black region, for instance, on the left here, as well as a white region. And the white region contains the so-called fair players, or those who do not use drugs, while the black region shows those who use drugs. And the left and right is kind of how we vary these two parameters C and R here, basically. So on the left we fixed the C parameters and then we varied the R parameters and we kept on doing that. Okay, so it's more, instead of doing this simultaneously, we did it one by one. And then you see here that we have changed the axis, so this one is kind of turned. Here is R on the x-axis and Y on the y-axis, and the opposite on the left figure here. What we see here is that there are basically, or actually only pure Nash equilibria. The only mixed region is on this red line. This is more or less a perfect replica of the two-player situation, where we either get everybody takes drugs or nobody takes drugs. So this is such some interesting observations, and we may kind of set out to try to prove this, that given a linear price function as we have here, that may have an indication or some kind of consequence on the distribution and simplicity of Nash equilibria. If we, however, move away from linear price function assumption, as in this case where we have a convex price function, then we see that the picture is changing dramatically, because there is a lot of mixed Nash equilibria that turns out here, and combinations of mixed and pure and so on. So we see that things happen here. This is in a sense a situation with a convex price function, meaning that we kind of give very much more to those on the top of the list than those on the bottom, so to speak, to say it simply. If you look at the same situation in a concave case, where we kind of do a more kind of egalitarian structure, you see the same type of pattern, but the region of dopers is then decreasing. You can see that now if I just push the button here. You see that the black area kind of drops below this red indication from the previous figure, so there's much less dopers in this situation than in this situation. This is kind of intuitive, isn't it? If you distribute the prize money with less emphasis or less weight on those who are kind of on the top of the list, then of course you'd expect that the gain now using rows should go down, and that's exactly kind of what we see here. Okay, so what did we actually do in the paper? What we did then, as an alternative to this, mainly because the referees demanded it, was to look at some exact Nash equilibria. And we started out by 3 players, then moved to 4, and the idea then was to try to look at some inductive possibilities in this process. Could we learn something from this math that should indicate some general stuff that we could prove? And it turns out that really did happen. This was a kind of tedious work, and if you really want to look into it, you actually have to download this file. It's available on the website of PLoS ONE, and of course, as this is open access, this is available for everybody, so you might as well just download it yourself. And if you have a look at it, you will see here that there is a fair amount of information. There are 17 pages here. This is actually a supplementary file for the paper itself, and it's kind of far too big to put into the paper itself. It starts, as you see, by an example. I'm kind of looking at how the new model corresponds with the original model, and then there is some proofs here on these 2 theorems. And then we kind of go through all these tedious maths of looking at all the different Nash equilibria that pops up in the 3 and 4 player case. And as you may see as we move along here, there's really a fair amount of math here. So unless you're extremely interested, I just suggest that you skip some figures here as well in the end. Okay, let's move on. Let's look at these 2 theorems. The first one says the following: given an instance of the n-player doping game, a common RC product for all players, and a linear price structure, which has some meaning related to the math introduced in the previous slide, the Nash equilibria are as follows. Everyone cheats when RC is less than a certain fraction, 1. Or 3, any pure or mixed strategy when RC, 2, everyone plays fair when RC is bigger than this same fraction, and of course the trivial case, so to speak, any pure or mixed strategy or an infinite number of Nash equilibria when it's equality. In the equality case, of course, this basically means that in the game matrix all numbers are the same. In that case, of course, you can combine all possible combinations when it comes to mixed strategy NEs, and as well as all pure. So this is the same kind of situation basically as you get in the 2-player game. Okay. If you recall the 2-player game, of course, we can extend that, introducing heterogeneous players, for instance, and then we observe mixed strategy Nash equilibria there as well. But the interesting point here is that if you kind of move from linear price functions into nonlinear ones, then these mixed strategy Nash equilibria, they come up without having to kind of add these, should we say, more complex versions of the performance enhancing drag. Okay, so this is a nice result, and this is proved, as I said, so this is correct in this sense, okay? I will return to some discussion on this in the conclusions. The other theorem says the following: given an instance of the n-player doping game and a common RC product for all players, and we make this assumption of a common RC product, which kind of, the reason is that it makes it easier, basically. The sufficient and necessary condition for the k players cheat and n minus k players play fair pure strategy to be a Nash equilibrium is as follows. So we kind of get a set of inequalities here that kind of binds these n and k together, and of course, given that as well, we can kind of look at how, for instance, Nash equilibria evolve when the number of players evolve, for instance. Okay, I don't have time to dig too deep into these technical parts anyway. Okay, let's look at some points here. Of course, the main thing which happens when you move from a two-player to an n-player game is that the math becomes extremely complicated. Okay, so this first point of complexity is obvious. The simple story of every or nobody taking drugs does not necessarily repeat itself, as we already have seen in these numerical experiments. Given a linear price function, then we have proved that it behaves as it did in the two-player case, but if you don't have that, then it suddenly changes. Some of you may note that in a two-player game, of course, all price functions must be linear because there are only 2 points. And what we're talking about here is how we divide this prize money between these two guys. Okay, and that could only be done linearly if there are 2 players. There's no options of doing that non-linearly. You need a third player at least to kind of make some kind of shape here. Okay. The second one is this the first theorem. Given linear price functions and a common RC product, the n-player game behaves as the two-player version. But as point 3 here says, most real-world price functions are non-linear. And of course, you may ask why. Of course, that's very good reasons for that, isn't it? Because if sports audience demand effort, and you want to maximize demand for the sport, then you would like the athletes to really try hard, okay? And of course, if the number 1 or number 2 or number 3 get the same kind of prize money, you can't expect them to try hard. So there are good reasons here to diversify prices from the bottom of the resulting list to the top. Okay, so you should really expect that in a kind of optimal setup of sports, it should be nonlinear, typically convex price functions. And if you look at the price functions in real life here, I think the paper actually has one example from the Golf PGA Tour. You will see a typical strongly nonlinear convex pattern. The basic learning from theorem 2 is that the region of predictability, or if you like, the amount of mixed strategy Nash equilibria increase when the number of players increase. Okay, so the more players you have, in a way, the more unpredictable the doping game becomes. It does not mean that you get more dopers or less dopers, or at least it doesn't have to do that. That depends on what kind of shape you have on the price function, as we saw previously. But what we categorically can say is that the unpredictability increases. It gets more hard to find out who uses drugs and who does not use drugs. Of course, if you randomize on doing it, then it's kind of hard to find out who did what, isn't it? Okay, it's tempting, isn't it, to say, okay, if this is a problem, why don't we just force every sport federation to use linear price functions? In that case, either everybody takes drugs or nobody takes drugs. And then it's easy, isn't it? It's just a single doping test is enough then. You just test one athlete, and if he's clean, everybody else is clean. Of course, given that we believe in our models, which perhaps we shouldn't, but that is kind of the logic consequence of this argument. And again, of course, as we said under point 3 here, there are really good reasons why these price functions should not necessarily be linear. So that does not seem like necessarily a good idea. Okay, so what about this point 4 here? Could we try to put that into some practical setting? Now let's look at something here, a final quote. It says here, an attempt to draw practical inference. And we quote the paper directly here. On the top here it says the benefit of P. Northug may not fight doping. Those not interested in cross-country skiing will not know about P. Northug. That's a very famous cross-country skier from Norway, who has had, should we say, a difficult history, at least the latter years. But that's not the point here. It says here that modern cross-country skiing has undergone a major structural change the latter years. To a great extent, the classical competition structure or interval starts have been replaced by an increasing number of common mass start events. Okay, I really hope you understand what this means. You know, when you compete on some kind of physical thing, running or skating or skiing or whatever, you can either start everybody together and the first one to enter the goal wins, or you can start one by one with some kind of time lapse in between. And the classical structure in cross-country skiing was the last one, a so-called interval start. It says further here, the actual reason for this change is of course labeled on demand and TV viewers, who presumably prefer to see a competition where the first man crossing the finish line is the winner, but also the fact that the time spent in mass start events is significantly shorter is of course also judged positive when competing to get TV time. Sport competitions lasting for 4 or 5 hours are hard to broadcast efficiently. And as you know, there's a lot of competition when it comes to TV viewers these days, so having the ability to kind of condense the time spent in sport contests may seem beneficial from the economic point of view. Furthermore, in an interval start event, now we're here, in an interval start event, even though you principally can compete with the same number of competitors, your actual number of real competitors based on your performance quality compared to the rest of the heat is in practice way below the total number of participants. What do I mean by this? Okay, why is cross-country skiing such that it's easier to win if you run a mass start and an interval start? The idea is that cross-country skiing kind of behaves like cycling. Okay, there is huge benefits in lying behind other athletes. You gain a lot in air resistance, and you also gain a lot in the actual snow, because the front skier will warm up the snow, and that produces better speed effects for those coming behind. Also, there are situations when there are snow or bad conditions, and it's in most cases much better to lie behind than lying in front. So in a mass start competition, you get a kind of increase in uncertainty outcome, if you like. There is suddenly much more athletes that could actually win the race. As it says here, however, in mass start event, the number of possible winners increase dramatically, meaning that you efficiently compete with a much larger group. Hence, based on this argument, if doping is to be controlled, designing your sport such that you have kind of more effective athletes competing is not necessarily a good idea. This is a principle or theoretically a kind of interesting point, because it tells us that the design of the sport itself may affect how or why or if and how or why you should fight doping. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? On the other hand, to our knowledge, this is perhaps the first real scientific contribution where we are actually able to demonstrate that directly. As you probably understood, there's a lot more possibilities in kind of extending this research. You can look at heterogeneous players, you can look at different drugs, and there's a lot of potential of looking at very complicated stuff here. Of course, the expected outcome is more or less an even more complicated doping world. And if I should kind of take one important point out of this, is that the simple picture you get if you limit yourself to look at two-player games turns out to be far more complex when you open up for a multiplayer setting. And of course, most real sport events are multiplayer settings, even though there are certain stuff like a single fighting match, for instance, or you can look at a football match between two teams. There is still most cases where more than two athletes compete together. And the idea of looking at how to design stuff such that doping may be easily controllable may be interesting to judge from a practical point of view. Okay, I think that ends my talk of today.